The story I'm about to share is one of unimaginable fear. It is a tale that will haunt you, as it has haunted those who lived through it. It is said to have happened in the late 19th century, in a small forgotten town, tucked away in the countryside. The town had no more than a few hundred residents, and most of them lived simple lives, far from the chaos of larger cities. Life was quiet in this town. The people there trusted one another. Doors were left unlocked, and everyone greeted their neighbors with a smile. But beneath this calm surface lay a deep superstition. The people believed in omens, curses, and restless spirits. These beliefs were woven into their daily lives, shaping how they acted and how they saw the world. One of their greatest fears was being buried alive. In those days, medicine was not as advanced as it is today. Mistakes were made. People who appeared dead sometimes woke up hours or even days after being pronounced deceased. This fear gave rise to strange customs. Many insisted on being buried with a bell above their graves. The bell was connected to a string that ran into the coffin. If the person woke up, they could pull the string and alert those above ground. In this town lived a young woman named Eliza. She was known for her beauty and her kindness. Eliza was engaged to a man named Thomas. They were deeply in love and planned to marry in the spring. Eliza spent her days helping her family and preparing for her wedding. But as the seasons changed, so did her health. Eliza began to feel weak. At first, she thought it was nothing more than fatigue, but her condition worsened. Her skin grew pale, and dark circles formed under her eyes. The townspeople whispered among themselves. Some thought she had been cursed. Others believed she was being punished by restless spirits. Doctors in the town examined Eliza, but none of them could find the cause of her illness. They gave her herbal remedies and advised her to rest, but nothing helped. One cold winter morning, Eliza did not wake up. Her family was devastated. Thomas was inconsolable. The local doctor declared her dead. He said her heart had stopped, and there was nothing more they could do. In those days, bodies were not kept for long. Eliza's family prepared her burial that same evening. Her mother insisted that a bell be placed above her grave, just in case. They lowered her coffin into the ground, and the townspeople gathered to pay their respects. As the last handfuls of dirt were thrown over her grave, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. The bell was tied securely, and the string was placed carefully inside the coffin. Sound asleep. Everyone returned to their homes, their hearts heavy with sorrow. But Eliza was not dead. Inside the coffin, her body lay motionless. Her breathing was shallow, so faint that even the doctor had missed it. Her heart beat slowly, quietly, like a whisper. Hours passed as she lay there, unaware of her surroundings. When Eliza finally opened her eyes, she was in total darkness. She tried to move, but the space around her was too tight. She could feel the smooth wood of the coffin against her fingers. Her chest felt heavy, and her breaths came in short, panicked gasps. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but as she moved her hands, she felt the string tied to the bell. She pulled it with all her strength. The bell above the grave began to ring. Its sharp, metallic sound pierced the silence of the night. In the small town, where superstition ran deep, the sound of a ringing grave bell was a sign of terror. It was a call from the dead. Thomas was the first to hear it. He lived not far from the cemetery. The sound jolted him awake, and his heart raced as he listened closely. He knew where the bell was coming from. He knew it was Eliza's grave. Without hesitation, he grabbed a lantern and ran toward the cemetery. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees. Thomas's breath came in quick, visible puffs as he sprinted toward the sound. His mind raced with questions and fears. Was it possible? Could Eliza still be alive? By the time he reached the cemetery, a few others had also gathered. The bell was still ringing, its sound urgent and desperate. Thomas fell to his knees in front of Eliza's grave. Without waiting for help, he began to dig with his bare hands. Dirt flew in all directions as he clawed at the ground, his fingers scraping against stones and roots. Others joined him, bringing shovels and lanterns. The group worked together, their fear giving them strength. The bell had stopped ringing, but they could still see the string moving faintly. It was a sign that there was still hope. Finally, they reached the coffin. Now, the wood was scratched and splintered from the inside. Thomas shouted for someone to pry it open. "It you, Pia." A man from the crowd handed him a crowbar, and Thomas worked frantically to lift the lid. When the coffin was opened, the crowd gasped in unison. Eliza's face was pale, her lips blue, but her eyes were open. She was alive, but barely. Thomas pulled her out of the coffin and held her in his arms. She was trembling and weak, but she was breathing. Eliza was taken back to her home. The town doctor was called immediately. He examined her and declared it a miracle. He admitted he had made a terrible mistake. Her family stayed by her side day and night, nursing her back to health. Slowly, Eliza regained her strength, but something had changed. Eliza spoke very little about what she had experienced in the coffin. She said. She remembered waking up in the darkness, feeling the tight walls around her. She remembered the suffocating air and the cold touch of the wood, but what haunted her most was not the fear of being buried alive. It was what she heard while she was trapped. Eliza claimed she heard whispers, voices that spoke in a language she didn't understand. They grew louder as time passed, filling her mind with strange, incomprehensible words. She described feeling as though she was being watched, even in total darkness. Her family dismissed these claims as the result of trauma. They told her she had been through a terrible ordeal, and that her mind was playing tricks on her. But Eliza was not convinced. Eliza became withdrawn after her experience. She no longer smiled or laughed as she once did. Her eyes seemed distant, as though she were always looking at something far away. She rarely left her room, and when she did, she avoided the cemetery at all costs. Thomas, desperate to help her, tried to comfort her. He reminded her of their wedding plans and spoke of the life they had dreamed of together, but Eliza would only nod quietly, her gaze fixed on something invisible. One night, Thomas found her sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. Her hands clutched the edges of her chair tightly, and her breathing was shallow. When he asked what was wrong, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "They're still here," she whispered. Thomas didn't understand. "Who's here, Eliza?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The voices," she replied. "They followed me. They won't leave me alone." Thomas tried to reassure her, but Eliza wouldn't be calmed. She began to describe what she had been hearing. The whispers had returned, growing louder each night. She couldn't understand the words, but she felt their meaning. They were angry, They didn't want her to be alive. Thomas suggested calling the doctor, but Eliza refused. "This isn't something he can fix," she said. Instead, she begged him to stay with her, to hold her hand and keep her grounded. The whispers grew worse as the days passed. Eliza began to lose sleep. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her body grew weaker. Thomas stayed by her side, but even his presence wasn't enough to stop her suffering. She told him she felt as though she was still trapped in the coffin, that the darkness was always with her. One night, the whispers turned into screams. Thomas was jolted awake by the sound of Eliza's voice. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched her ears, trying to block out the noise that only she could hear. "They're here!" she screamed. "They're trying to take me back." Thomas held her tightly, whispering soothing words. But Eliza wouldn't calm down. She begged him to light every candle in the house, to keep the shadows away. He did as she asked, filling the room with flickering light. But even then, Eliza continued to shake with fear. She pointed to the corner of the room. "Do you see them?" she asked. "They're standing right there." Thomas looked, but there was nothing. The corner was empty. He told her so, but Eliza shook her head. "They're here," she whispered, "waiting for me to fall asleep." That night, Thomas didn't leave her side. He stayed awake, holding her hand and watching over her as she dozed off. But even in sleep, Eliza was restless. She muttered under her breath, her words disjointed and filled with fear. The next morning she woke with a start. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she reached for Thomas. "It's not over," she said. "They're going to take me back." Thomas, consumed with worry, decided to seek help beyond the town's doctor. He visited the village's elder, a woman named Agnes, who was known for her knowledge of old traditions and lore. Some called her a healer. Others whispered that she dabbled in forbidden arts, desperate to save. Eliza Thomas told her everything: the burial, the whispers, and Eliza's growing fear. Agnes listened intently, her expression grim. When Thomas finished, she leaned closer. She was touched by death. Agnes said in a low voice, "When someone is buried alive, their spirit is caught between two worlds. Something from the other side may have followed her back." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What can I do to help her?" he asked. Agnes hesitated before replying. "The bond must be severed. If it isn't, they'll claim her. I know Nutidant. Bring her to me tonight, and we will try to set her free." That evening, Thomas brought Eliza to Agnes' cottage. The elder woman had prepared for their arrival. 9 6 9 charmed. Her small home was filled with the scent of burning herbs, and strange symbols were drawn on the floor in white chalk. Candles flickered in every corner, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Eliza was reluctant to enter. She clung to Thomas, her eyes darting around the room as if she could see the unseen. Agnes approached her gently, speaking in a soothing tone. "You are safe here," she said. "We will keep the darkness away." Agnes instructed Eliza to sit in the center of the room, within the circle of symbols. She placed a protective charm around Eliza's neck and lit more candles. Then she began to chant in a language Thomas didn't recognize. At first, nothing happened. The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the candles. But then, the temperature dropped. A cold wind seemed to blow through the room, though the windows and doors were shut tight. The flames of the candles flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows. On the Aunanel, Eliza gasped and clutched the charm around her neck. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're angry," Agnes continued her chant, her voice rising above the growing noise. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and move. Thomas stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Eliza cried out, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. "They're pulling me back," she screamed. "Don't let them take me." Agnes grabbed a handful of herbs and threw them into the fire. The flames roared, casting a bright light across the room. "You will not have her," Agnes shouted, her voice filled with authority. "Go back to where you came from." The room shook as if an unseen force was trying to break through. The shadows grew larger, more defined, taking on shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Eliza's screams echoed through the room as Agnes continued her ritual, her voice unwavering. Finally, with one last chant, the room fell silent. The cold air disappeared, and the candles burned steadily once more. Eliza collapsed into the chair, tears streaming down her face. Thomas rushed to her side, holding her tightly. Agnes looked exhausted, but relieved. "The bond is broken," she said. "They can't take her now." But as they prepared to leave, Agnes gave Thomas a warning. "The connection to death leaves a mark," she said. "She will never be the same. Watch over her and keep her away from the dark." In the weeks that followed, Eliza seemed to recover. Her strength slowly returned, and the dark circles under her eyes began to fade. She smiled again, though it was rare and fleeting. Thomas remained by her side, doing everything he could to keep her spirits up. He tried not to think about Agnes' warning, but her words lingered in his mind. Eliza no longer spoke of the whispers or the shadows. She avoided the cemetery and refused to go outside after dark. Though she tried to resume a normal life, there was always a sense of unease around her. She seemed to flinch at small sounds and avoided looking into mirrors for too long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas found Eliza sitting by the window again. She was staring out at the forest beyond the town, her expression blank. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to him with tired eyes. "They're watching," she said softly. Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine. "Eliza, we went to Agnes. She said they were gone." Eliza shook her head. "They never left. They're waiting for me. I can feel them." Thomas tried to reassure her, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. That night, he stayed awake, listening for any sign of danger. But the house was quiet, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas began to believe that perhaps it was all in Eliza's mind. He encouraged her to focus on their future, on their wedding plans, and on rebuilding their lives. She seemed to respond, growing more engaged and even laughing at times. But one night, everything changed. Thomas woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. He reached over, but Eliza wasn't in bed. Panic surged through him as he grabbed a lantern and rushed downstairs. The door was ajar, and a cold wind blew through the house. "Eliza," he called out into the night. There was no response. He grabbed his coat and ran outside, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows. The town was silent, and the streets were empty. "Thomas' heart pounded as he made his way toward the cemetery. A sinking feeling in his chest. When he arrived, he found her standing by her own grave. The bell that had once saved her life was gone, its string severed. Eliza stood motionless, her back to him, staring at the ground where her coffin had once been buried. "Eliza, what are you doing out here?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. She didn't turn him around. "They called me back," she said, her voice distant. "I can't fight them anymore." Thomas ran to her, grabbing her shoulders and turning her to face him. Her eyes were empty, as though a part of her soul was missing. "You don't have to go with them," he pleaded. "You're safe now. You're with me." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him. "I tried," she whispered, "but they'll never stop. I was never meant to come back." Before Thomas could respond, a cold wind swept through the cemetery. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Eliza's body went limp in his arms, and her eyes closed. Thomas screamed her name, but it was too late. The wind died down, and the shadows disappeared. Eliza's body was still, her face peaceful, as if she had finally found rest. Thomas buried her again the next morning, this time without the bell. The town mourned her loss, and whispers of her strange story spread far and wide. Some said she was cursed. Others believed she had been chosen by forces beyond their understanding. Thomas never left the town. He visited Eliza's grave every day, speaking to her as if she could still hear him. He never married, and he spent the rest of his life haunted by the memory of her final words. Even now, the story of Eliza and the ringing bell is told in the town. It serves as a chilling reminder of the fine line between life and death and the forces that may lie in between.